Lucian is used to, receiving prizes and winning first places. Scott, I think, is just making his personal tradition. So congratulations to both of you for a fantastic, really a fabulous paper that is a must-read for everybody. But for the fact that it's 123 pages, but very well worth reading. So when I saw the paper, when we voted on the winning papers, what we thought, and what I think personally, is that this is precisely what ECGI stands for. So this is the paper that talks about the heart of corporate governance, and it presents in the best kind of tradition of Lucian, the Lucian Bebchuk powerhouse, a complex issue in a very lucid way, touches upon the theory. There's a simple and very convincing theoretical account, amassing a lot of evidence, organizing it in a very understandable way, and then draws important policy implications. And even if you don't agree with some or many or most of the policy implications, it forces you to think about them and make your own view on them. Personally, I am convinced by most of what they say, and I have some quibbles that I keep for the next part. What I would like to do now is to invite Paolo to say a few words of congratulations. I myself want to say a few words of gratitude on behalf of ECGI for sponsoring this prize. You can see you contribute to a very good cause, so thank you very much on behalf of all of us.
Thank you, everybody. It's a real honor and privilege to introduce the winners of this Cleary Gottlieb Prize for the Best Paper in the ECGI Law Series. Unlike Aberdeen Standard, this is the first edition of this prize sponsored by Cleary Gottlieb. The first of many, we hope. Cleary Gottlieb is really a proud sponsor of this prize, and is very proud to support independent research by leading academics. As a firm with over 1,200 lawyers from more than 50 countries, which are practicing across different jurisdiction, continents, the work of prominent academic scholars as Lucian Bebchuk and Scott Hirst is extremely valuable for us. On behalf of Cleary, I would also want to thank Marco and the European Corporate Governance Institute for this opportunity, and in particular the members of the jury that engaged these leading scholars and selected the winners, and by bringing them together in one truly European, but I would rather say global organization and network as ECGI, which is extremely important. We are all impatient to hear from the author, so I will not take more of your time. Allow me just to say that this paper by Lucian and Scott on index funds is particularly important in this time of change and in this constantly evolving corporate governance landscape. Academics, practitioners, but even more importantly, regulators need to be aware of the stewardship role that investment funds in general, but particularly passive funds, should, could, and will need to play in the future. And those regulators in particular need to put forward proposals that maximize the positive effect. I do not anticipate, but I can show from my words what I think about your paper. I am even more convinced than what you just said. Anyway, it's not surprising that this paper is also titled Theory, Evidence, and Policy, which is exactly what the Cleary Gottlieb Prize wants to support and to encourage also in the future. The application of high-level theoretical research to the real world in order to increment and increase the quality of our legal framework. So without further ado, I leave the floor to the authors, and once again I ask you to join me in congratulating for their wonderful job. Thank you. Oh, they are two. Oh,
There are two. I'll take your mic. Here you go.
thank you. If I can.
Can we do-
Take pictures afterwards. So thank you, Paolo and Amir, for your kind words. Thank you also to Cleary Gottlieb for sponsoring this prize, and for your support of corporate governance and for legal scholarship in this area. It's an honor to have received this, and we're also grateful to ECGI for choosing this paper and for giving us the opportunity to share it with all of you. Lucian and I would like to give you a sense of what's in the paper in case you don't want to read all 120 pages of it yourself. I'll start off and then Lucian will follow up. And so what we do in the paper is really what's in the title. We talk about theory, evidence, and policy. So first of all, we develop an agency cost theory of index fund stewardship decisions. And then for evidence, we put together a hand-collected and set of public data to look at the full range of stewardship activities of the big three index funds, BlackRock, State Street, and Vanguard, and what these funds do and what they don't do. And spoiler alert, we find that evidence is consistent with the agency theory that we put forward. And then we identify a range of policy implications of our theory and our evidence. So I should say that the project is part of a larger work on the agency problems of institutional investors in a 2017 paper that we co-authored with Alma Cohen. We looked at the agency problems of institutional investors in general. And then in another paper which appeared this year in the Boston University Law Review, we looked at how the growth of the big three mean that within 2 decades they could control approximately 40% of the equity of large US companies. So turning first to the theory that we put forward in the paper. And the argument that we put forward is that stewardship decisions are made, because stewardship decisions are made not by the fund's beneficial investors, but by investment fund managers, then this will lead to agency problems in the stewardship decisions. We look at a benchmark of the decisions that would be optimal for the investors in the index funds themselves. So that is, we don't argue that index funds stewardship is worse than what would happen in a world where corporations were owned by diverse shareholders or by active funds. Instead, we argue that agency costs are a first-order driver of stewardship decisions of index funds, and that looking at these problems and understanding them can help to limit or reduce their effect. So we look at 2 kinds of incentive problems. So first of all, incentives to underinvest in stewardship relative to what would be optimal for the investors in funds. And secondly, incentives to be excessively deferential to the managers of portfolio companies. And then we gather a range of evidence. So first of all, we look at the amounts that these investment funds invest in stewardship. And we consider the fact that each of the big three have hundreds of billion-dollar positions in portfolio companies. And you would imagine that this would justify multiple professionals dedicating a substantial amount of their time to monitoring and interacting with the managers of those portfolio companies. So supporters of index stewardship have focused on the number of personnel that they have, and we ask, what's the extent of these personnel compared to the portfolio companies that they manage? So this is the number of personnel on the top line that each of BlackRock, Vanguard, and State Street employ. The important line here on this graph is the percent on the bottom line, the percent of the income that they earn that goes to stewardship expenses. And it's less than 0.2%, less than a fifth of a percent for each of them, and in some cases less than a sixth of a percent. So what do they do with the stewardship that they do devote to their portfolio companies? So we look at the number of person days that their stewardship can devote to each of their portfolio companies. We come up with a variety of different scenarios. The top one is just the number of stewardship hours or person days for each of the portfolio companies in their portfolio. So BlackRock could spend a total of 1 day on each portfolio company. But even under the most generous view in the bottom line, assuming that they spent 75% of their time on US companies, and then for each $1 billion position that they held, and again, there are many of these, BlackRock could spend a total of 4 person days per year on that particular company. So what do each of the companies, what do each of the investment managers need to do with that time? So looking at evaluating a portfolio company might require looking at hundreds of pages of documents, annual reports, business performance, executive pay arrangements, proposals that are up for a vote, the views of directors on those matters, and the company's performance. But the amount that these index fund managers devote to stewardship only allows them to devote a cursory amount of attention to each of these companies. Secondly, we look at private engagement by the index fund managers. So the big three have stressed that private engagement is the most powerful tool that they have. Vanguard has said it's the most important component of their corporate governance program, and it's where the action is. So we look at the proportion of the portfolio companies of the big three that they actually engage with. And here's the important line at the top. 92% of companies on average over the last 3 years had no engagement whatsoever with the big three. Of the companies that they did engage with, most of them were limited to a single engagement. So they didn't have engagement with the great majority of these companies. So for those companies, private engagement can't serve as a substitute for other stewardship tools, which we'll look at later on. And then I'll now hand over to my co-author, Lucian, who will continue to explain the additional stewardship and the policy implications.
Thanks a lot, Scott. So the next dimension of what the big three do that we document and empirically analyze is that, as many of you know, but we document it looking at the data, they focus on governance, principle-based stewardship. We document that when they so we document that looking at a number of dimensions of their activities, both the way they describe their engagement and also reviewing their proxy voting guidelines. Now, the reason why this is consistent with the agency cost view is that focusing on governance principle-based stewardship enables you to reduce your total investment in stewardship. And also, it makes the potential power of the big three less salient. And we explained that they have incentives in order to prevent regulatory backlash, is to make their power less salient. But this gives up us the benefits of some stewardship that is not based on governance principles alone, and we'll come to this shortly. The fourth dimension of what they do is how they vote. We look at voting, similar to the paper that was earlier presented, also looking at a much more limited set of context. One in which we focus very much on is votes on executive compensation, which we think is a good context for which to examine incentives to be differential. What you see here in the table is that the incidence of voting no on say-on-pay proposals by the big three is an order of magnitude smaller than the percentage of no votes by the largest active funds. Now, this is not decisive. Somebody might take the view that perhaps the active funds are insufficiently differential, but certainly the pattern that you see in front of you is consistent with deference incentives. Next, let me go quickly over a number of things that the big three do not do, or at least don't do adequately. First, they seem to devote limited attention to performance. Most of the people here would agree that performance is very important for the beneficial investors in the index funds, and therefore optimal stewardship might involve monitoring financial performance, and if there is underperformance, trying to make changes or facilitate changes that would address this. But when we examine the large number of examples of behind-the-scene engagement that are described in the stewardship report of the Big Three, we find no cases in which the engagement was motivated by underperformance. What they are usually motivated by are governance problems or other issues. Moreover, when we look at the proxy voting guidelines that the Big Three have with respect to what determines how they vote, whether to withhold support or support incumbent directors, we see that they all focus on governance aspects. So concretely, if you have the same governance situation, the Big Three would vote in the same way on a director if the company is in the top 5% in terms of performance or the bottom 5% of performance, whereas we would take the view that performance should be a relevant aspect. Okay. Could it be that this pattern is because the Big Three, as some authors have argued, also that view Big Three stewardship more favorably, that the Big Three, it's not part of their business model. They simply don't have the in-house expertise to pay attention to performance. Sure, they don't have the in-house expertise, but when we think about these issues, we shouldn't take the lack of in-house expertise as given. This is, in the language of economics, this is endogenous, namely the index fund certainly have the resources to hire the people that would provide them with in-house expertise. And therefore, when we try to understand why they don't do it, the question is whether they have incentives to do so, which we argue they don't. Another dimension of things that they don't do is they pay little attention to director characteristics that seem to us relevant and important. They pay a lot of attention to the process through which directors are selected, and also to some governance-related aspects, other director independence, and so forth. But there are other aspects. What's your expertise? How much you know about the industry? What talents and education you have, and so forth. And we provide evidence that outside the context of the infrequent situations of hedge fund activism, the Big Three do not pay attention to those characteristics. And not only they don't base their voting, but they also don't communicate with companies about this. Another dimension of what the Big Three don't do is they don't submit shareholder proposals, and therefore they don't take advantage of an important tool that they could use to bring about governance changes that they themselves support. If you look at the US governance landscape, you see that shareholder proposals have been very successful when they pass to bring about certain changes like annual elections, majority voting, elimination of supermajority provisions. Those are things that the Big Three, by their own governance guidelines very much support. But we document that among the very large number of proposals on this subject that the Big Three themselves regularly supported, none of them was submitted by the Big Three. Now, somebody can try to explain this by saying the Big Three, it's sufficient for them just to be reactive, just to vote when proposals on the table. They don't need to bring proposals themselves because other shareholders, smaller shareholders, are already bringing them whenever it's desirable. But we argue that that cannot be the answer because of the limited resources of smaller investors. Proposals have not been submitted, or sometimes submitted just with a delay of many years, in a large number of situations where, had the proposal been submitted, there was no question that the proposal would have garnered support from the Big Three and would have passed, and therefore with high likelihood been implemented down the road. As a result, a large fraction of public companies still do not have governance arrangements that the Big Three in principle support. And we take the view that if the Big Three were to use the powers that they have as shareholders, they would be able to bring about a much larger adherence to their own governance principles. Another final dimension of what the Big Three fail to do, at least on an adequate scale, is they seem to systematically remain on the sideline with respect to corporate governance reforms. Because the Big Three have positions in a large number of companies, it would make sense for them to try to bring about legal reforms that would improve the value of each company even just by a little bit, because the benefits to their portfolios and to their beneficial investors would be quite significant. But the evidence that we hand collect shows a pattern of very limited involvement. Two situations, two contexts. One is we review all the 80 rules with respect to corporate governance that the SEC proposed over a period of more than 2 decades. One might conjecture, thinking about it initially, is that with on the order of 20% of all corporate equities, the Big Three will take a view and will submit their view, will express a view on practically every rule that is on the table and under consideration. They would either support it, or they would oppose it, or they would say, look, this rule is unimportant or not sufficiently worthy of the SEC limited time and attention. We would express some view. However, what we find when we review the dockets is that the Big Three submitted comments with respect to less than 10% of the rules, and that's true for the set of all proposed rules, or even if you look at the set of proposed rules that got the most attention. And this is much lower incidence of participation relative than the two largest asset owners, CalPERS and CalSTRS, who own on the order of 5% of the assets that the Big Three own. And similarly, we find similar patterns when we look at presidential litigation, all the important cases that attracted a lot of friends of the court briefs. We find that the Big Three, unlike some major asset owners, did not submit a single amicus brief to all those significant cases. Okay, so the third part, and I won't have time to go over them, but the third part puts on the table for discussion a number of policy proposals that are aimed at addressing those two types of problematic incentives: incentives to underinvest in stewardship and incentives to be excessively differential. That's all described in the paper. I'll briefly also note the implications of our work for some important ongoing debates in the corporate governance landscape. One of them, as many of you know, there is a substantial debate on hedge fund activism. Our analysis has two implications for it. One, we show that by contrast to the views of some opponents of hedge fund activism, we can't rely on the presence of large index funds that are long-term players and committed by what they say to stewardship. We cannot rely on them alone, and that hedge fund activists play a critical role. But the second, and I think perhaps more significant implications for the state of the current debate, is that there are some views in the literature, for example, Gilson and Gordon expressed this view, and others, that states the combination of index funds and hedge fund activists works very well. So as long as we have the hedge fund activists, we don't need to worry about the problematic stewardship incentives of the index funds, because the hedge fund activists would identify problems, the index fund would support them, and everything will have a happy end. We say that won't work for two reasons. One is that to the extent that the index fund managers have incentives to be excessively differential, they will not always support the activist hedge funds, and therefore the activist hedge funds in many cases won't engage in the first place. And secondly, that activist hedge funds by their own structure are going to engage only when they can make a large change quickly. Otherwise, there isn't enough for them to gain. And therefore, if you think about the large set of situations where there are potential significant gains from ongoing governance stewardship over many years, if the big three and other mutual funds don't do them, the activist hedge funds are not going to take care of the slack. We also have, our work also has implications for the corporate ownership debate that many of you are familiar with. We take, in terms of normative implications, somewhat opposite view to that of the common ownership critics. In our view, the first order concern is not that the index funds are using their power too much and are pushing companies too much. We think that the first order concern is that they are not doing enough in terms of stewardship, and that if scholars lead regulators to push index funds to be even more cautious in their engagements with companies, that would be counterproductive. Lastly, I want to say a word about the interaction between recognition and reality. Index funds have significant, or at least the big three, have very substantial incentives to be perceived as responsible stewards. And therefore, if there is greater recognition by beneficial investors, by the public, by thought leaders, by researchers like the people in this room, that could by itself, even without implementation of the reforms that we discussed, they could by itself lead to improved stewardship, and we hope to help a bit in bringing about such recognition. So let me conclude that the evidence we have put together is consistent with the agency cost view of index fund stewardship that we put forward. And given the centrality of index funds and the growing importance, those agency problems deserve our close attention. Thank you, and thank again to to Amir, Marco, and Paolo.